So yeah, today's talk is all about unlocking the mystery of React's re-rendering, and we are going to be talking about performance a little bit as well. But first, let me ask a question. Raise your hand. How many of you think of performance from the beginning? The minute you start writing any code, you start thinking about performance. Please raise your hand. OK, we have quite a few, which is amazing. And it also is great because a lot of you are just like me because we don't think about performance from the get-go. A lot of us think of performance as an afterthought. Once it starts to become a bottleneck, and once we get those infinite re-renders, and that's when we realize, OK, we are doing something wrong here. So when our components are slow, when our app is too slow to load, that's when we start thinking about performance in general. But that shouldn't be the case. And in this specific talk, I want to go back all the way and kind of discuss React's re-rendering patterns and how we can learn a bit of that so that we don't have to do that as an afterthought. So hello, my name is Ankita. I am currently an educator. I transitioned to being that a few months ago. But previously, I have been a senior engineering leader, worked as a solution architect developer. You can find me on YouTube and also on Twitter. But if anyone has a blue sky invite, please come find me later. Because we all know that we all want those invite codes. Yeah, but I also have a YouTube channel where I focus mainly on helping developers level up in their engineering careers. So yeah, please subscribe. That's what YouTubers say. Or I should say like and subscribe. Anyway, so here are all my slides, which you can find, and there's a barcode as well. And I also write a weekly newsletter if you want to check that out too. All right, so why does performance matter? Like, if you have to think about it, let's start from the get-go. Why does performance matter? Because the user of your app are not going to care about which library, which framework, which NPM package we geek about. They are going to care about how fast your app loads. Now, we were on a Wi-Fi network. I feel like in a huge part of the world, I feel like that is the reality. The apps won't load as fast. Images they're too slow to load. And that is the reality for our users. And you are committing a crime when your app does not have dark mode, which is what I have learned. Anything I've deployed, the first question I get is, it doesn't work for dark mode. And so we are going to build an app to basically talk about React's re-rendering cycle. So let's build a dark mode app. And it's very simple, it's straightforward. We have a logo, which is the Dogecoin. And then there's a button there. So whenever you click on toggle dark mode, it transitions from dark to light, light to dark, and so on. And this is the architecture of an app. We have the logo, we have the dark mode, we have some text that says dark mode enabled or disabled. And we also have a footer called Anki Kobe Bean Incorporation. Now, if you want to know why that is the name of my company, please come find me later, because that will become a really good story to talk about. But yeah, that is the footer component in general. So when React captures a snapshot of this specific UI, then this is how it looks like. What React is, you need to think about like this specific snapshot, but in general, what React does is think of it like a photographer that's taking a photo of your component like DOM. It has a logo, footer, and it tries to capture in memory, this is what it looks like. So let's say that it takes a photo. And if you want to enable updates in component re-renders, which is what we will do for our app, our dark mode app, you can go to the profiler and click on highlight updates when components re-render. Because that is really important, because that is the beginning, I guess like the basics of performance in general. So what happens when I toggle that on and when I click on that in general? You can see this flash, right? Like the logo flashes, the footer flashes, and so on. That's what happens when you start profiling your app. So if we take a look at that specific code, we will see that this is how our home looks like. We have a state for dark mode and set dark mode, right? We have a logo component. We have a button with the on-click handler. And at the bottom, there's a footer. And you can see that, so I've used Tailwind for this app, but I have removed a lot of that code just to make it easier in general. So now if React were to recapture the snapshot of this UI, as the dark mode changes, then it's still like it has the footer, it has the toggle dark mode, and the logo in general. But again, it's trying to, as our dark mode state has changed, it has recaptured, it has retaken a photo just because it doesn't, the state has changed, it doesn't remember anymore. So now we have 2 photos instead of 1. So what is re-rendering? Now, React's main job is to keep UI in sync with your application state, and the tool it uses is called re-rendering. So what all it wants to do is doesn't want the user to see stale data. We always want to show fresh data. So that's our goal for re-rendering, right? And throughout this talk, we are going to go back to this goal as well. We want to reduce the amount of work that any of our components or our code does, but also reduce the number of re-renders in general. And with re-rendering, that's the job of re-rendering in general. And there is a common misconception that a component re-renders when the prop changes. It doesn't matter whether the component's props change or not when we talk about, in general, re-rendering of components which are not memoized. And we will talk about memoization in a second. But when a component re-renders, it tries to re-render all of its children. Well, it doesn't matter if you pass it a prop or not. The fact that the state changes in the parent component, it re-renders, which trickles down to all its children components. And I think this in itself is a huge thing when you think about performance. So yeah, this is a really good photo for that, a GIF for that. Re-renders only affect the component that owns the state, and all its children if it's any. So when a component re-renders, it re-renders all its children. And we don't want React to re-render when it's not needed. That's something that we don't want, as we discussed in our goals as well. But why does it happen? Like, how can we prevent that from happening? So let's talk about how React works in general, right? So application state changes, then it triggers the re-rendering. For example, photos are being taken by the re-rendering tool, and it re-renders, all the children gets re-rendered, and your view gets updated. And that is exactly what React does. And along the way, it decides, should it re-render, should it not? What are things that we can do to help that? So again, React's main job is to keep the application UI in sync with the state, and the point of it is to figure out what needs to change and why. So if you profile our little app again, and you can click on that icon in the Profiler tab to start profiling it, you can see that, for example, the logo component over there is something that does get re-rendered, right? Logo re-renders when it should not, and same for footer as well, because they are the children of the home page that we saw. So you can see how long it takes, and it re-renders. It's going to re-render every time dark mode changes. But in reality, we don't want that, right? We don't want our logo or footer or components that are pure. Whenever we give it an input, it's the same output over and over. We don't want that in general. So how do we solve for this? Well, how do we solve for the logo component to avoid re-rendering in general? So what we can do is we can wrap logo and footer in memo, and this will allow it to memoize the component in general. So React knows that it doesn't need to re-render. It's going to just, the same photographer that we talked about, it's not going to click a new photo. It's just going to give you an existing photo. Like, hey, I have this photo. Let me take this, because it doesn't need to, unless there is some state and prop that changes. So that's where memoization comes in, and that we just took a look at that. You know, hey, I know this component is pure. You don't need to re-render, right? And that is the idea of memoization. I kind of think of memoization because I've done like full stack development as caching as well, right? It caches the data, and we tell it, hey, change it or not. So if you profile a little app again, as we added the memo code, right, you can see that it doesn't flash anymore, because even though we are changing the toggle dark mode, right? And that's the thing with it. And if we pause that specific GIF that we looked at, you can see that there is no footer nor logo when we profile our app as well. And again, as you start building these components, I think what's important is that you start profiling it. Don't wait for towards the end or like when you're starting to deploy your application to production. Make this as part of your code review process and ask these questions if this is something that's needed or not. So now let's move our dark mode logic that we saw. It was quite messy in there, right? I had a handler code inline as well. I had the state inside. But in the future, I do want to use dark mode because, as we saw, we don't want to commit a crime. We want dark mode to be used in other apps and as well. So let's create a hook. We all like custom hooks, so let's do that. Let's call it dark mode. And the part that I want to highlight here is here we are returning the dark mode and handle toggle function. But notice that I have wrapped it inside a useCallback, a hook that's available for us so that we can, again, tell to not specifically cache that, to basically cache the specific function. And for example, useCallback in this case will cache functions. It will return the cache function, and then that dependency array is very important right there, because what it's going to do is we're saying is, hey, you can purge the cache if the dependency changes. Otherwise, just keep giving me the same function over and over. And that's the whole point of useCallback. So again, going back to our specific hook again, you can see that dark mode, but we only want that specific function to change when the dark mode dependency array changes, right? And that's why we have wrapped it inside a useCallback. Now, do you necessarily want to, like, how many times are we going to change dark mode or not? But in this case, this hook is going to be used in a lot of different applications, and I want it to be as performant as possible. So, for example, going back to useCallback, if we didn't do that, we will have the same function but different copies, right? A brand new function on every single re-render. And we don't want millions of set toggle. Maybe it's being a bit dramatic, not millions, but many functions in general. So depending on the dependencies, we only want to change or give it the same copy. And again, useMemo is also something that we use in general with useCallback. And again, it caches things, and we'll talk about things in general. But it returns the cached value. And again, the same dependency array is used to decide if you want to purge cache or not. And this is the code for it. I know it looks scary. I wanted to reduce it. It's very simple, and this is just for example's sake. So for example, we have the color, set color, and color as states. And then there's a very expensive computation right here. And what we're saying is, whenever color changes, run the expensive computation. Now, with useMemo, this function will only run when the state color changes. But imagine we didn't have that, right? We did not wrap it inside useMemo. There's no dependency array. That means every time the component re-renders, this expensive computation is going to run. And we really don't want that. So that's why we are depending on the dependency array, and we are depending on it, and we're sharing it like, hey, don't change it. So again, that's the whole point of useMemo in general as well. And I want to also take a quick break here as well, so because I'm launching a course and a program in general, which is called Developer to Leader. So this is a program that helps developers transition into engineering leadership. So if you're interested to become a leader or see it in the future, then definitely check it out. And yeah, so this is the barcode for it, and it's developerleader.com. And yeah, it's really fun. A lot of, I guess, 30 or so people have signed up already. And if you're interested, come find me later as well and ask me any questions you may have. So going back to performance steps. So what you want to do is you want to test it on every single device and network. Now, again, a lot of us have really high-speed internet that doesn't represent our users, right? For example, we saw that at least the Wi-Fi was a little bit slower than usual. Suddenly, I started noticing that how my websites are performing. In fact, developer to leader, I was like, I need to cache more things. I'm going to take a look at it and see what are more caching that I can do on that website. Because there are certain things that were really slowly loading. So what you want to focus on here is that you want to test on low-end devices. You want to test on slower networks and throttle. And in Chrome, you can do that in developer tools, test out on different slower networks and slow on, and throttle it. And lastly, profile your app on production mode, not just development mode. Why? Because in development mode, we have a lot of things enabled in general that in production mode, that's not the reality. So you want to test on both. But as you start to scale your application, you want to think about these things in general. Personally, I would also just do it as part of every feature or every user story in general that you take on. But I also want you to remember that you don't want to fix what's not broken, because React is also really performant out of the box. We don't need to do a lot, but as you start building and as you start building these components and as you start getting more aware about it, that's when you need to start thinking about it. But again, let's remember our goal with re-rendering, right? We want to reduce the amount of work. We want to reduce the number of re-renders, and that is like our formula, right? So in this case, should you use useMemo and useCallback everywhere? Right? We talked about we want to memorize everything. We want to cache everything as much as possible, right? But useMemo is only valuable in a few cases. Now, one of them being the calculation that you're putting in useMemo is noticeably slow, and the dependencies rarely change. So again, it goes back to the dependency array that we talked about. Another method that I would recommend using, and if you're not sure if a function is slow or not, or if there are certain things that you need to profile better, then you want to maybe also use console time or timer to like test out exactly how fast your function is. So again, you want to make sure that what you add in the dependency array is really important. But you don't want to wrap every single function in general with useMemo and useCallback. So how do we do this for hundreds of apps, right? Hundreds of components in general. Because we just talked about dark mode, which is a very simple, straightforward example. But you can think of it like a very good basic example, which does cover a lot of use cases, right? But as I said, you want to start with the profiler, start profiling your apps, start measuring the performance of your components, start building that awareness in your team in general, make it part of your code reviews, and overall look at your architecture. And during code reviews, you want to ask, should we wrap this function inside useCallback? Do we need it cached or not? How much it's going to change, and so on. And lastly, what's really important here is that, for example, sometimes it's easier for React to re-render with many props. In this case, for example, a card component. And I'm not saying that you should not wrap any of the card component with useCallback or useMemo or whatsoever. What I'm saying is that sometimes when you have a lot of different props, if you go back to React's job of to figure out re-rendering or not, what you want to think of is, should we wrap every function or memoize everything? Because what React is going to do, or the re-rendering tool that we looked at, it's going to compare, right? What has changed, what has not. And the fact that we do it over and over every single time, sometimes it's a lot easier for it to just re-render, right? And going back to the photographer example that we said, let it take as many photos as it wants, because this component is more expensive to memoize each and everything and for it to compare, because it's going to be a lot more work, and then figuring out the dependency change versus in general. So card component is a good example of that. It is very complex, right? Like if you think about card component, this is a very simple example, but we have different color properties in this product for lipstick, and let's say this is an e-commerce application. Then in general, you have a lot of different props with the photo, with the description. You want to make sure that this specific product tile renders in the right sense, and there are a lot of handlers in general, accessibility props, and whatnot that you want to think of. So when it comes to a complex component, really try to assess if it's worth it based on the dependencies, and if it's how much time does it take, and profile it every single time, because you want to do that as part of your job. And lastly, Lighthouse doesn't really represent performance, because React is performant out of the box. But in general, that's the first step you should do, right? You should go to Lighthouse and check your performance score. But if Lighthouse says it's 99, does that mean that it is really performant, right? Does that mean that you don't need to worry about it in general? Not really, right? Because 99 in Lighthouse is basically an average that they take just to understand, okay, on average, how much time it would take to measure the performance of an app, but it doesn't really represent production. You still need to do all these different practices, and Lighthouse can be the first step, but there are many more steps that we talked about in this specific talk that you want to do as part of your performance. So again, like building that awareness really helps. And Lighthouse, I know that there's work being done. As I was talking to a couple of speakers, that where they are adding some properties to change a lot of this, and we can learn more about our performance in general. But again, that's great, but you still want to be doing all these things that we talked about, because again, that's a good cherry on the cake. So yeah, that's it from me. Thank you so much for checking out this talk. And yeah, go to developer2leader.com if you're interested, and all my slides are here. Thank you so much.